Thanks for joining us. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. She's recovering from a cold and will be back next week. President Obama stands by embattled Veteran Secretary Eric Shinseki, but demands answers on alleged misconduct at VA hospitals. Establishment Republicans declare victory in Tuesday's primaries. And recalls at General Motors reach an unwelcome high point in company history. Joining me for the domestic hour of our Friday News Roundup, Ron Elving of NPR, Karen Tumulty of The Washington Post, and Alex Burns of Politico. Welcome to the Diane Rehm Show.
Good to be here.
We invite our audience to not only listen to us, but to watch us. We're live streaming on drshow.org. Later in this hour, you can call us, join our conversation. Our toll-free number, 1-800-433-8850. Send us an email at drshow@wamu.org. or find us on Facebook or Twitter. Well, Ron, President Obama had a news conference Wednesday to address these allegations of misconduct at VA medical centers. What did the president say?
The president expressed what might be called a restrained degree of confidence in General Shinseki, whom he continually called Rick. I suppose if you wanted to be cynical, you could say that the president was so angry at Rick Shinseki that he agreed to let him stay in his job. I'm not sure how badly the general wants to stay in the job at this point, but he is a good soldier. He is himself a disabled veteran, lost part of his right foot in Vietnam. I think he has a great deal of understanding for the veterans involved here, but he is going to have to deal with a firestorm of anger around the country among veterans and in Congress, where they've already passed a bill in the House to make it much easier to fire somebody if they happen to have the bad luck of being an executive in the Veterans Administration right now. And they're going to have to be measures taken. You know, there are really several things going on here. Number one, and the most serious thing, is the allegation that records were falsified and that people were trying to make their performance look better. The second thing is this story that comes out of Arizona from a whistleblower about 40 people having died while waiting for an appointment to see a doctor. That is the juice in this story at this point. That comes from CNN, and that's a big story. But then the other thing, and the bigger thing, is all the things that have been done over the years to save money in the VA, making it necessary for veterans to prove that they need help rather than making it necessary for somebody else to prove that they don't when they think they do.
This story, a lot of it broken by the Arizona Republic, the newspaper in Phoenix. Well, Karen, we are now hearing not only Republicans calling for General Shinseki's resignation, but also some Democrats.
That's right, including a number of Democratic Senate candidates, including so I think that you're going to be hearing this growing louder and louder among Democrats as well as Republicans. The problem here is that I think everyone's first focus is that you've got to figure out what the problem is and how to fix it. And to put a confirmation hearing on that, a big fight over the replacement on top of that, possibly makes it more difficult to actually solve the problem in the near term.
Of course, that's an argument that was made about Health and Human Services during the whole botched rollout of the Affordable Care Act website. And one reason some people thought that the secretary there, Kathleen Sebelius, kept her job for months. Alex, were you surprised that General Shinseki, at least at the moment, has not been asked to resign?
I wasn't surprised, just because, Susan, I think you've seen this with the president a number of times, where when he has someone on his team or who he wants to have on his team who he has some kind of personal relationship with going back a while, he really does dig in. How many cabinet nominees did he throw overboard before he decided to really get into the trenches with Chuck Hagel when that nomination looked like it was in such trouble? He did let Kathleen Sebelius stay in that job, I think well past the point where it was politically convenient. And you look back at sort of how early she was with him in the 2008 campaign. Eric Shinseki's a guy who, clearly in the middle of a terrible scandal right now, but there's a reason why you haven't heard John Boehner call for his resignation yet. There's a reason why a lot of the people taking aim at him are Democrats jockeying for political distance from the president rather than Republicans who are really eager to take on a decorated veteran right now.
Although I interviewed Bob Dole yesterday, he is maybe the nation's leading veteran. I mean, in a way, a disabled World War II veteran, a 5-term senator from Kansas, a leader on veterans issues since he got into politics, and the person who introduced Eric Shinseki at his 2009 confirmation hearings, calling him a true American hero. And Senator Dole did not call for Shinseki's resignation but he did not offer him a kind of full-throated endorsement. He said that if the investigation shows that he didn't do what he should have done, he ought to go.
You know, back in the Bush administration years, Dana Priest at the Washington Post did a fabulous series of stories, a disturbing and tragic series of stories about what was going on at Walter Reed. And that led to some major changes, and that led to what was supposed to be the cleaning up of the VA system and what we were able to do for the veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention all the guys who are still around from World War II and Korea, and a lot of Vietnam vets who make up a large part of the population in the VA. And everyone thought that that problem had been so looked at and so cared about that it must have been dealt with. So I think the most disturbing thing here on Shinseki's watch, since he's been there since day one of the Obama presidency, is what has been done to carry forward all of those promises that were made about cleaning up the VA.
Well, that is sort of the paradox here, is that, in fact, I just went, and as recently as mid-April, the VA released a big survey that they do every year on satisfaction with the system. In fact, it was higher than it is for patient care among recently treated people in the VA than it is for people who are in private hospitals. And a number of people, as we were going forward with healthcare overhaul, would argue that the VA system is actually an argument for government involvement in healthcare. So again, this is a horrific tragedy, but it had come at a time when I think the VA, was feeling like it was actually doing, at least a fairly decent job, and most veterans who actually interface with the system had thought that it was doing a decent job.
So, Alex, is this the kind of issue that could have some impact on the midterm elections in November?
I think anything that drags down the president further than he is right now is really toxic for Democrats. You talk to people in the party, and they say actually they're less worried about Obamacare at this point than they are just about Obama. When you look at sort of the way people view him in the states that really matter in this election, I think, Susan, the bigger sort of effect that this has on the issue debate here is Democrats have been trying for 5 or 6 years now to make the case that the American people ought to trust government to have a bigger place in their lives. That's the big debate over the Affordable Care Act, over banking reform, over environmental regulations, which we're going to get more of this summer, that the government, the government is here and it's here to help. And I think every time there's a story like this, or the NSA story, or any number of the sort of administrative healthcare.gov, obviously, it makes it a lot harder for the party to make the idea, to make the case that, the safety net is a really important government function that Republicans would threaten if they were in control of the Senate.
And of course, unlike a story like the Benghazi story, it's not one that's got a big partisan split. I mean, there's nobody who does not believe our veterans should receive the care they need.
Then the same is true with the IRS scandal as well. I think this has a resonance. It has the potential to do more damage politically than either of those.
So Republicans were cheered this week, Ron, by the results from some of these primaries where establishment Republican candidates, many times incumbents, were facing more conservative Tea Party challengers. Tell us what happened.
Conventional Republicans surely were pleased with the results, particularly from Kentucky, where there had appeared to be a strong challenge to Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader. Matt Bevin, the guy who was running against him, had money, he had a story to tell, he had a big head of steam, and that head of steam seemed to dissipate pretty quickly. He got caught up in side controversies, and let's look at Mitch McConnell. He went out and raised more than $1 million and spent $10 million, and spent more than $10 million on his primary, kind of unheard of. But he also outmaneuvered his opponent in every conceivable way, and in the end made a stronger argument for what he could do for Kentucky as an incumbent who might just be the majority leader if Republicans take over in November. That was symbolic or emblematic of the results all over the country on Tuesday.
Alex, tell us about Georgia.
Well, you had a crowded field of Republicans there competing for the open seat of retiring Senator Saxby Chambliss. And at the beginning of this cycle, you had Democrats say, if we get either one of these two really hard right members of Congress, Paul Brown or Phil Gingrey, they think they have an excellent shot in the general election. Those guys finished 4th and 5th in this primary. And the top two finishers were David Perdue, this former Reebok CEO, sort of your classic self-funder, I'm a political outsider and I'm not part of the system and I'm here to fix it. And then Jack Kingston, an 11-term member of Congress, most distinguished for appropriating a lot of money for his district and his state. So these are the results you would have expected to see from a Republican Senate primary in 2002. Not in the Tea Party era.
And, you know, it's such a contrast to the results we saw in 2010 and 2012, when arguing that you were the more electable Republican in the general election, Karen, was not seen as a badge of honor.
Well, and as a result, the Republicans nominated over the last 2 cycles, 5 candidates who turned out to be not viable in the general election. I mean, if they hadn't nominated the people they did in those 5 states, they would have control of the Senate now.
So, you know, I saw some analysis that said, into the Tea Party. Is that how you take it?
Only if you think of the Tea Party as a party. It's never really been a party in the conventional sense. It was shorthand that we all used, ad makers, activists, journalists, certainly, for an anger, for a very intense feeling in the Republican, well, let's say in the conservative world of America, some of which is Republican and some of which doesn't consider itself represented by Republicans, but which is clearly conservative, and they wanted something other than what they were getting from the election of President Obama, Democratic Congress in 2008, and also something other than what they saw the Republicans offering, and they were intense and angry and focused. And the way it fell in a lot of these states, the incumbent Republican didn't see it coming. Richard Lugar, for example, in Indiana. Mike Castle in Delaware freely says he didn't anticipate what happened there. The person who should have had the nomination and gotten elected to the Senate didn't see it coming and got beat. That didn't happen this time.
You know, you can argue that the Tea Party lost this battle, but has won the war, because a lot of these establishment candidates are espousing really conservative, Tea Party-friendly kind of views now. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll go to the phones, we'll take your questions, we'll read your emails. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. And with me in the studio, Ron Elving, senior Washington editor for NPR, Karen Tumulty, national political reporter for The Washington Post, and Alex Burns, senior political reporter for Politico. Let's talk about the issue of same-sex marriage. Man, this is like a train that is rolling down the track. Karen, what do we see happen this week? 3 more states moving.
Yeah, Utah, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and it's all going one direction. And again, I think that when you think of it was only 10 years ago that there were same-sex marriage ballot initiatives on the ballot in something like 17 states, and every single one of them came down on the anti-gay marriage side. It's been an extraordinary shift. I think it represents where public opinion already is going, especially on a generational level. You even talk to people like, evangelical leaders, and they say they look out in their pews at young people, and they've already lost this battle with them.
Although we should note that in all 3 states, these were judicial decisions. None of these involved votes by the electorate.
Although at the same time, you did have the Republican governor of Pennsylvania, who's up for re-election this year, come out and say, I think this decision is likely to stand on appeal, so I'm not even going to challenge it. And then next door in New Jersey, there wasn't a new decision this week, but Governor Chris Christie, potential Republican presidential candidate, announced he was going to reappoint the judge who authored the decision striking down New Jersey's ban on same-sex marriage. That's a pretty remarkable turnaround for just leading members of that party.
Just real quickly, later on this morning in Denver, Colorado, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals for the federal system, is supposed to issue the first appellate ruling on some of these. It covers Utah and Oklahoma, and we're expecting them to make a decision here that would eventually reach the Supreme Court, because we expect the Supreme Court to look at some of these judicial opinions. But it's going to be enormously important what the circuit courts of appeals do, and this is the first one weighing in.
You know, one thing that is so interesting about this issue is that on other social issues where the courts have ruled on, I'm thinking about school desegregation, for instance, or abortion rights, it's fueled a fury. It hasn't settled the issue, but in this issue, Karen, it seems like these court decisions are things that people are accepting and adopting.
And even on this issue, as recently as, when was it, in Iowa, just, not even a decade ago, it did fuel a huge backlash. And that is what is remarkable here, is that is not happening.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's talk a bit for a moment about Benghazi. We referred just briefly to that controversy earlier in this hour. Long debate, Alex, by Democrats in the House over whether to join this investigative panel, but now they've decided to do so.
They did. Nancy Pelosi appointed 5 Democrats to this select committee, including Tammy Duckworth, the veteran from Illinois, a couple members from the West Coast, Adam Schiff, Adam Smith, who have been really involved in military issues. And, part of the thinking here, at least part of the thinking here, is that you're going to have this Republican chairman, Trey Gowdy from South Carolina, hauling in members of the administration and former members of the administration like Hillary Clinton for depositions and public interrogations, that there was this idea that maybe we can just undercut the committee by not participating in it. And at the end of the day, the thinking that really reigned was Elijah Cummings from Maryland, who's going to be the ranking member on this committee, just saying, we got to be on the field if the Republicans are going to be coming at our guys.
So do you think Hillary Clinton will be called to testify?
Hard to imagine that she wouldn't be. She was Secretary of State at the time, and a lot of the focus here is going to be on what kind of security arrangements were made and what kind of care was taken with whether or not an ambassador could do what was done in this particular case, which is going out beyond his security patrol. And
it's, and the reporting suggests that, in fact, it was the Clinton people who went and argued with the House leadership that, yes, there did need to be some Democrats on this committee, that, it couldn't be essentially mute on one side. If she does get called to testify, I suspect that we're not going to see the same sort of performance that we saw from her the first time, where, she was saying, what difference did it make? I mean, at this point, I think she's going to be in a very different footing herself.
What do you think the risks are for Hillary Clinton in this investigation, Alex?
I think that it's sort of a total toss-up in my view whether this is a risk versus reward proposition for her, because when has a House investigation into the Clintons ever backfired on Republicans, right? But look, if she goes in there and gives, as Karen said, the same kind of combative performance that she did last time, I do think this is an issue that has legs, just in terms of whether the American people view her record in the State Department as one of sort of responsible, sober leadership, or whether they really just view her at this point as an entirely political figure. Because when she was in state, even after the 2008 campaign, before she went to state, was still in the U.S. Senate, the farther away from politics Hillary Clinton is, the more the American people like her, right? So as long as she can stay kind of above the fray and present herself almost as just this, dull technocrat kind of at the State Department, that's when she's been at her best.
It's a star opportunity, really, for her. When you think back to the Iran-Contra hearings in 1987, there was this thought at the time that this was going to be a big slam dunk for the Democrats, because they really had Ronald Reagan where they wanted him, and they were going to embarrass him, and they were going to embarrass the Republicans. And instead, what we got from that was the creation of a star in Oliver North, of all people. And, these things, these big show trials, they can bounce a lot of funny ways.
I covered those hearings, and I remember Oliver North and the pictures of him raising his hand, taking the oath that made him look like a pretty heroic figure. You're from San Antonio, Karen. We've got the mayor of San Antonio heading this way this afternoon for an announcement to join the president's cabinet.
That's right, Julian Castro, who is one of the great rising stars of politics, and one of the few sort of up-and-coming younger generation Latinos that the Democrats have. On the Republican side, we have people like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Susana Martinez, Brian Sandoval. This, however, I think is sort of a plan B for Mayor Castro. He had made no secret of the fact that he had actually intended originally to run for governor in 2018 in Texas, because the thinking was that the state was shifting demographically, and apparently, I mean, people close to him have told me certainly that Wendy Davis, the Democratic nominee in Texas, her kind of weak performance so far has kind of convinced everyone that that date of that political shift in the state is further off than Democrats had hoped it was. Julian Castro in Texas was in the position, as one person said to me, of being, an all-star playing on a losing team. So this will give him, I think, a national platform, a national, and potentially, it could lead to another cabinet post. It could even lead to being on the ticket for a Hillary Clinton or some other Democratic nominee in the future.
Although, you think about the current HUD secretary, I'm not sure that most Americans could come up with his name. Who is he, Alex?
It's Sean Donovan, Susan. So I did come prepared for the pop quiz. But look, I think that if you look at what's happening in another obscure cabinet department right now, the VA, it underscores what an incredible risk this actually is for Castro. This notion of you take a dull cabinet position, sit it out for a couple of years, hey, maybe you end up as vice president. Lord only knows what's going on at the lower to mid levels of HUD that a House Republican investigation might uncover under Secretary Castro's watch. He's got this golden thing going on in San Antonio, and it's true, if you want to run nationally, you got to get a little higher than mayor first, but gosh, I don't know. I mean, to me, there's a pretty good argument for just waiting it out in Texas. He's a young guy, so if it's 15 years until he's governor, could still be a pretty young president.
Well, on the other hand, you raised this prospect. Jack Kemp went from Congress, where he was a star, and of course he'd been a football star, and then they sent him to HUD. And kind of crickets after that, because he did run for president, but all the old buzz was gone, and he just really didn't fly as a presidential candidate. He came back much later as a vice presidential nominee, didn't make it in that regard either. I'm not sure HUD is a great launching pad, but they really wanted to get another Hispanic in the cabinet. They really wanted to position this guy to at least be in the conversation to be Hillary Clinton's running mate.
And he had made no secret of the fact that his own preference would have been to have been education secretary, because his big legacy issue in San Antonio was getting the city to raise the sales tax to fund pre-K.
Meanwhile, Sean Donovan is not out of work. We expect him to be nominated to be budget director, replacing who, Alex?
Oh, gosh.
Matthews Burwell.
Shoot.
As budget director.
Yes, of course, naturally.
Yeah. I didn't actually mean that to stump you. You get the HUD secretary, and yet not the budget director?
Job currently vacant, right? Not ousting somebody. I'm just going to call this a technicality, and we can move on from there. But look, I think that we've seen this as an enormously important job in this administration. If you go back to some of the biggest stars, actually, of the Obama cabinet, back to Peter Orszag, so there are a lot of words that people in Washington would use for Peter Orszag, but Jack Lew, that when the main flashpoints between the administration and Congress are all around spending and budgeting, this is actually a job of tremendous consequence, the way maybe it wasn't a couple years ago during the Bush administration.
Let's go to the phones and let some of our listeners join our conversation with their calls or questions. Let's talk first to Tom. He's calling us from Pittsburgh. Hi, Tom.
Hi, thank you. I want to talk about the VA for a minute and the root cause of the problems at the VA. And I know that there's an investigation going on. Certainly, upper management is a problem. It's way too top down, not listening to staff and so forth. But I think we're going to find that funding is an issue, and of course the funding comes from Congress. And I'm wondering if with the congressional hearings, that it's going to kind of bounce right back to Congress, although I doubt they're going to let that happen. But I think funding is an issue. But I'm a veteran, and I worked in Army Hospital. I am a retired officer, and I have Medicare, Part A and B, and TRICARE, and I've never used the VA, and I never will. And there's probably a lot of us out there. And I want to make the comment that if we took all the funding for the VA and bought health care from existing civilian facilities and so forth, would we be a lot better off? We have an overcapacity situation in many of our cities in this country. Pittsburgh, certainly, we have overcapacity. And isn't that money a lot better spent on facilities, physicians, et cetera, that are working?
All right, Tom, thank you so much for your call. Thank you for your service. We have an emailer who raises a similar question. Bruce writes us, until Congress is willing to fully fund the VA at the current level of need, these problems will continue. Is this fundamentally an issue of funding, do you think?
I think funding is in there, but the fact is there was, if you believe the allegations, there was also fraud and misconduct being committed, and especially falsifying these records. So yes, funding is likely to come up as an issue, but I think that again, the misconduct is going to probably be the overriding storyline here.
And here's an email from Randy. He writes us from Baltimore. He says, it is my understanding that most veterans have a much more favorable view on the VA than that found in the general population. I'm a vet, and I know that I have very favorable views on the VA system. If anything, it makes me an advocate for single-payer health care.
Yeah, in fact, I can read you the statistics that were just released for 2013. And again, this is a big survey the VA does every year. And the satisfaction for inpatient care in the VA was 84% and 82% for outpatient care.
I'm Susan Page, and you're listening to The Diane Rehm Show. We're taking your calls, 1-800-433-8850. Let's take another call. We'll go to Bonnie calling us from Rochester, New York. Bonnie, thanks for joining us.
Yes, hi. Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about the Veterans Administration situation, and my comment is also concerning generally all public services and public employees, both state, federal level. So that the comment is, on the one hand, with the veteran situation, of course, if there's been misconduct and there's been stuff that really harmed patients going on, that has to be dealt with, and whatever the causes of those. But I also want to put in a voice for the fact that I noticed with a lot of these discussions around veterans and other public employee services, which on the one hand have been attacked a lot by people looking to find excuses to attack them, that the employees, the representatives of employees, the labor people, the union representatives are hardly ever present in any of these kind of discussions. So I actually wrote something yesterday, an email, when this subject came up on NPR and Diane Rehm yesterday, and saying the same thing. I really would like to see the representatives from the labor organizations present at these kinds of discussions at all levels of government, because this is a public service is a huge issue reflecting many things, and people, when you have them come, they actually know a lot about what's going on.
Bonnie, thank you so much for your call. Alex.
I think it's interesting how quickly the VA debate actually has become a labor issue, although not exactly in the way that Bonnie's describing. This bill that's before Congress that Ron mentioned earlier that the House passed, the big contentious point now being debated on the Hill is how easy it should be for somebody like the VA Secretary to fire career civil servants who are unionized and who are protected by all kinds of statutory job regulations from being fired for misconduct on the job. So there are folks certainly on the Republican side and some Democrats who support this bill who say part of the problem here is public labor, that these folks in the senior executive service who are immune from the kind of oversight that political appointees get. I think you're going to see, certainly there's an argument for labor representatives being more represented at different levels of government. I think you're going to hear even more furiously the argument being made that they should be less represented.
Ron, this bill passed the House almost unanimously, not quite. What are its prospects in the Senate?
Yes, just 33 votes against it, I believe, in the House, which is pretty much the minimum. In the Senate, however, it now goes to the embrace, if you will, of Bernie Sanders, who's the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the Senate. And Bernie has been waiting for a chance to talk about some of these issues for a very long time. And he has a number of other things on his mind, too, by the way. And he would like the attention that is going to come with this, and he would like to probably make this a transformative moment for making everybody think about the VA differently and to think about a number of other issues as well. So it's got a lively history coming in the Senate.
Bernie Sanders, he might be interested in running for president, Karen.
Well, that's right, although I don't think too many people are giving Bernie Sanders much of a shot, but he is certainly very, very, he's incredibly articulate, and he is very, very skillful at getting attention when he wants to get attention to an issue. I mean, any of us who watched his filibuster of a couple of years ago know that.
But, you know, even candidates who don't have much of a chance or maybe zero chance of being elected can really affect the course of a debate.
Well, and that's what you have on the Democratic side now, is people just assume by default that Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee, and with good reason. But someone like Bernie Sanders represents a much, much more liberal version of the Democratic philosophy. He's not even actually elected as a Democrat. And so you have people out there like him using the platforms they have to try to box in Hillary Clinton on the issues that they care about.
Alex Burns of Politico, and we're also joined this hour by Karen Tumulty of The Washington Post and Ron Elving of NPR. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll go back to the phones. We'll take your calls and questions. We'll read your emails. Stay with us.
National broadcast of the Diane Rehm Show is made possible in part by Inada, maker of the Dreamwave massage chair with body scanning technology and shiatsu point detection. Learn more at dreamwavechair.com. By the Kauffman Foundation, educating startups through the Kauffman Founder School, online at entrepreneurship.org. By Novo Nordisk, committed to innovation in diabetes care for over 90 years. More at novonordisk-us.com. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is NPR.
On the next Diane Rehm Show, the Friday News Roundup. In Ukraine, violence flares in the east as the country prepares for a presidential election. China and Russia sign a $400 billion natural gas deal. And Thailand's military seizes power in a coup. The Diane Rehm Show, next hour. General Motors hit a record this week. They would, I think, rather have avoided. They announced more recalls, bringing the totals to the highest point in the history of the company. What is going on here, Ron?
You can call it an abundance of caution after this devastating blow they have taken over their mishandling in past years of this ignition problem that led to fires, that led to deaths. Now they have brought in 35 new safety inspectors in the company who are crawling over every vehicle they have and every complaint they have received. And so whether it involves a fatality, which as I understand it, none of these recalls are actually about a defect that led to a fatality, although some led to accidents and injury. This spreads across a number of different models. It was 2.5 or almost 2.5 million initially. Now they've added several 100,000 to that number of their rather small models, which apparently is an ignition-related problem. But most of these have to do with other things like seat belts and things of that nature.
You know, you've watched the rebound of the U.S. auto industry with some relief, I think, since the financial meltdown in 2008. Does this have implications, do you think, for the health of the U.S. auto industry?
Oh, I think it does. And the real issue on the ignition switch, beyond the human tragedy of these 13 deaths, was that GM apparently knew about the problem. They knew about it for a decade and didn't fix it. So that is the kind of thing that really, just destroys people's confidence. Although Toyota's been hit by this kind of thing too. So with recalls. So it isn't like the American auto industry is the only one who's doing this.
Well, it's an old Washington lesson. It's not the crime; it's the cover-up.
Well, and in this case, I think it's clearly a terrible public relations problem for GM. They paid a $35 million civil penalty for the ignition switch issue, right? Which is not like big money for an auto company. I do think it's also, when you think about just success stories of the Obama administration, they love talking about the auto turnaround in the 2012 election, probably kept Michigan and Ohio in the Democratic column. And I think maybe it's a little bit harder now to point to, so-called government motors and say what a great success story that was.
AT&T announced Sunday it would buy DirecTV, yet another media merger, Ron. Why do we see so much consolidation in that industry?
It seems to be largely about content. It seems to be not just to make yourself bigger and make it easier for you to make money in the sort of classic way of merger, but this is where people are trying to get control not only over their own technology and delivery, but over the content that might be the most lucrative source for them for revenue going down the road. So, for example, with respect to this most recent one, there seems to be a very valuable football franchise involved in terms of the ability to watch any game that you want to watch on Sunday, and a lot of money being available with football becoming more popular all the time. And so it has a lot to do with getting the control over not just the delivery of product, but the product itself, that is to say, the content.
So, Karen, a good deal for consumers or a bad one?
For the next few years, they have promised to hold prices steady, that they have also promised so-called net neutrality. They're not going to be cutting special deals so that some providers, can get in with better service, better speed than others. But after 3 years, all bets are off. And I think most people think prices go up.
Net neutrality, and this is such a complicated issue to me. Who can explain it briefly, what we're talking about when we talk about the net neutrality debate?
Well, basically, in very broad strokes here, because I'm not any more of an expert on this than I am on the Office of Management and Budget, is you have the concept of net neutrality is the idea that the internet should essentially be like a water company, where you don't have some people paying more money to get better water than other people, that everybody gets the same water at the same rate, or more or less, right? So you don't have AT&T or your service provider saying, if you're a big company or if you're a very wealthy person, you can pay a mint for your broadband access and get in a so-called fast lane where content streams much faster, et cetera, et cetera. And this is an issue both for consumers, both for the little guy who wants to be able to watch House of Cards on Netflix, and also for, it's a huge issue in Silicon Valley for folks who are sort of up-and-coming entrepreneurs who worry that in the event that you get these sort of fast lane carve-outs for the really big companies, that you end up stifling innovation for folks who can't bear the startup cost of paying for that.
And it's also an issue where we see the FCC taking a stand, changing policy.
That's right, and the FCC proposal that's out there is very unpopular with a lot of people who want to protect things the way they have been. And there is, I think, a kind of romantic notion among a lot of people that the internet can still be what it was when it first began, and that all of these concerns about privacy and who is using it to do what and who's getting what kinds of information about you, and all these concerns we have about who's making more money than somebody else and getting more advantage of their commercial partners than anybody else, those kinds of things. Gee, can we just make all that go away and go back to the 1990s? I'm afraid that's going to be difficult.
So the Justice Department has to approve this deal. Karen, do we think they are likely to do so?
At this point, it looks like the deal is on track, but who knows? I mean, I'm not expert on this either.
Let's go to the phones and bring back some of our listeners. Let's go to Cleveland and talk to Marty. Marty, hi, you're on the air.
Hi, I wanted to respond to the veteran who never uses the VA, and I'm a veteran who does use the VA, and I think it's a really good system. I think it's underfunded, and Congress is calling these people to the carpet for some things, and I think they're not facing up to the real problem, which is Congress not providing enough money for the VA so that everybody can get to their appointments and not have to reschedule and not have to miss appointments. The VA just doesn't have enough money. So the real culprit is Congress. They need to fully fund the VA so that all veterans could be seen.
Marty, thanks so much for your call. Thank you also for your service. We've also gotten an email from John who writes, first of all, he says, correcting a point we made earlier in this hour, he says, Walter Reed is not a VA hospital, is in the Department of the Army system. But John also writes, I am a self-employed veteran. I receive all of my health care at the VA hospital in Cleveland. I have been thrilled with the quality and timeliness of care I've received. It is a fabulous facility staffed with very capable and caring professionals. Thanks very much for that email. Let's go take another caller. We'll go to Vermont and talk to Tom. He's calling us from Norwich. Hi.
I'd just like to offer a little bit of a counter-narrative about the VA and just give a few specifics. The VA is actually way ahead of the private sector in certain areas. These include especially computerized patient record systems and implementing evidence-based best practices with patient interactions and things like that. So, people shouldn't get this narrative that the VA is somehow inferior to the private sector. In many ways, it's superior. Second of all, I'd like to point out that there seems to be an overabundance of coverage about these recent allegations, given the fact that A, they are allegations, and B, they are in a small number of facilities in a very large system, and that this kind of negative coverage has two really awful side effects. One is it's terrible for the morale of dedicated professionals who often are working for less than they could make in the private sector because they want to serve veterans. And second of all, it scares veterans away from going to the VA where they can get the best care for things like PTSD and TBI.
Tom, that's such an interesting point you make. Do we have a sense, Alex, of how widespread these allegations are? Is it limited to Phoenix, or have we heard about examples of these delays and even falsified reporting in other places?
Yeah, I think Phoenix is clearly the worst actor in the system. We have heard of allegations of similar kinds of misconduct at a couple dozen other locations, although, as Tom said, this is a huge system, right? So if you're talking about, 26 facilities, that's still percentage-wise very small. I think this is, partly, the White House has sort of assured people that they really do think at the end of the day this is going to prove to be a pretty contained thing as opposed to a systemic problem. I think you have heard some pretty prominent veterans advocates. I spoke to Bob Dole myself earlier this week, and just sort of coming out and saying, like, look, relative to other countries, we do more for veterans than most other places in the world. So, I think we still don't really know where the bouncing ball is going to end up on this, but I do think those folks in Phoenix have a world of pain coming their way.
Let's go to Tidewater, Virginia, and talk to Leonard. Leonard, hi.
Hi, Miss Page. I'll tell you, if I can get to a device at 10, I never miss Diane. I like her soothing voice, and I wish her a speedy recovery, but I'm just as happy to hear you moderate.
Oh, well, Leonard, thanks very much.
I hope this isn't off topic. I'll preface this by telling you I'm a self-confessed liberal, and the only place I have to voice my opinions is in the mornings on local talk. It's very right-wing. They are convinced they're going to sweep the Senate, and I've even heard them saying they're going to pick up at least 50 seats in the House. But these are my thoughts. I think the executive branch is going to be in an FDR Truman era. I think the Democrats going to keep the executive branch for several terms. I think the Senate is going to stay in Democrat hands. I believe the Republicans will hold the House until about the next census, 2021, 2022, when redistricting is done again. And those are my thoughts. I hope that's not too off topic.
No,
I love
not
you
at
guys.
all. Leonard, you could be an analyst on the Diane Rehm Show. Well, let's talk about what we think will happen in the midterm elections, talking about the Senate. As Leonard notes, a lot of Republicans feel pretty good about their chances of winning control of the Senate.
And they should, because if you look at the retirements, they're very heavily weighted to Democratic retirements, and many of those retirements are in states that were carried by Mitt Romney, that were carried by John McCain. There are probably 5 seats just right off the top that will probably go Republican, where a Democratic incumbent retired and had that incumbent run for another term, the seat would have remained Democratic. So that's a huge head start. That's a huge head start. Number 2, the Republicans don't look likely to lose any. There will be a close race in Kentucky where Allison Lindergan Grimes is the Democratic nominee, and she looks like a strong candidate, and the polls show that's close. Georgia's looking kind of tough for the Democrats, and apart from that, it's really hard to find another real race around the country. So unless something really shocking happens in the remaining primaries, it looks like the Democrats started a deficit of maybe 3, 4, 5 seats just from vacancies against the Republicans, and then there are a lot of other vulnerable Democratic seats in the South and elsewhere.
So what about the House? Leonard notes that Republicans all think they're going to pick up seats in the House. That would put them in close to perhaps an historic majority for the GOP in the House.
Yeah, I think the opportunities in the House, in part because of the way the lines are drawn, are not there for great sweeping changes. And the other thing is, while there's a lot here that's going in the Republicans' favor, some Republicans I've talked to are concerned that the party itself has not really put forward an alternative vision of what it would do if it were in charge. And this is going to be a really important predicate for the 2016 presidential election. As Republican pollster Dave Winston, who advises John Boehner, said to me, an opportunity is not an outcome.
Interesting line, perhaps something to live by. Alex, what is the Republican message? Is there a unified Republican message for November?
I think to the extent there's a unified Republican message, it's just that you have to punish this president for health care, and you can't trust these Democrats to spend your money, right? And that has worked pretty well for them in the past. I think Leonard's point is pretty well taken, though, that all the forces that make Republicans strong in midterms, their dominance with white voters, their dominance with conservative voters, the way the health care issue plays out, particularly in the South, make them weak in a presidential election. So I think the real test of the Republican Party as a long-term institution is whether at the end of primary season in July or August, or once you're past the real bulk of primary season, whether you do start to hear the party move in a more constructive direction on policy and maybe say some stuff that they couldn't say when they had Matt Bevin or Chris McDaniel or one of these other really hard right primary challengers breathing down their neck.
So if that's what amounts to the unified Republican message for November, Ron, what is the unified Democratic message for November?
The Democrats have been trying to push a message of addressing income inequality with policies such as the minimum wage, and they've been pushing a picture of a more realistic America with regard to immigration, where we revise the immigration laws to recognize where we stand in that area, and on social issues as well.
I'm Susan Page, and you're listening to The Diane Rehm Show. We've been taking your calls, reading your emails, but first, Karen, I want to talk about a series that the Washington Post has been doing. You've been very involved with that. 50 years ago this week, President Lyndon Johnson launched his Great Society program. You've been taking a look at the repercussions, the history, the legacy of the Great Society. What have you concluded?
Well, it's extraordinary the degree to which the Great Society really does shape so much about how we live today. It's big programs like civil rights and Medicare and Medicaid. It is things, National Public Radio is itself a Great Society program. So I think that LBJ's legacy was so overshadowed by Vietnam that, only now are people taking a look at both the degree to which it has shaped every single aspect of our lives, but also the fact that we are still fighting about just about every single bit of it. It seems like every political debate in this country somehow or another can trace some roots to the Great Society.
Alex.
And the Great Society, I think Karen's articles have been really important reading for really everyone who's following the current debates about the size and role of government. That, yeah, we are still fighting about Medicare and we are still fighting about federal funding for public and higher education. But these programs have largely remained intact and gotten more popular. So even as the reputation of government and government workers and government spending has just completely tanked, I think even a lot of Republicans who favor entitlement reform will tell you Medicare is not going anywhere and the Department of Education isn't going anywhere.
Major props to Karen's series. It's really been inspiring and fantastic to see all of that brought together in one place and to renew that history. Another thing that happened in 1964, of course, was Barry Goldwater was nominated to be the Republican presidential candidate, and that began really the modern pushback, the modern era that led to Richard Nixon and specifically to Ronald Reagan and to everything the Republican Party has come to stand for in the years since then. So in a very real sense, LBJ not only defined a great society, but he also defined the arguments against it and defined the positions of both parties for a half a century.
One of the lessons from LBJ may be the vantage point of history, because for 50 years, LBJ has been known mostly as the president who became enmeshed in the Vietnam War. And I wonder, Karen, if you see a period of sort of reassessment a legacy that's more three-dimensional for him.
I think this year has been sort of one anniversary after another, starting in January with the anniversary of the war on poverty and the great debate over whether that succeeded. Certainly, one thing that, even though it was probably the most controversial thing he did at the time, that everyone now agrees was a good thing, were the Civil Rights Acts, that only the federal government had the capacity to dismantle these barriers that were really keeping large segments of our population from fully participating in American life.
So a great part of his legacy, but something that proved to be politically pretty costly for Democrats for a long period of time.
A long period of time in certain parts of the country, right, that you're looking at, certainly for the last 50 years has been a pretty steady downward track for Democrats, maybe capped by the Senate elections this November. But, I think you are seeing really the fruits of a lot of what was done during that time in terms of civil rights, in terms of immigration, coming to fruition now as you see really this new diverse national electorate coming into play in presidential elections in a big way.
I want to thank our panel for this hour's discussion. Alex Burns of Politico, Karen Tumulty from the Washington Post, Ron Elving from NPR. Thanks so much for being with us on the Diane Rehm Show.
Thank you.
Great
Thank
to
you.
be here.
I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. She'll be back next week. Have a great holiday weekend. Thanks for listening.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Susan Casey Neighbors, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Dunn, Danielle Knight, and Allison Brody. The engineer is Toby Schreiner. Natalie Urb-Lifker answers the phone. Visit drshow.org for audio archives, transcripts, and podcasts. Call 202-885-1200 for more information. Our email address is drshow@wamu.org.